morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Daily Commute. My name is Dan. I'm the host this morning of this here show, and I thought today we could have a little chat about the only thing we really could talk about today. Today is Saturday, September 11th, 2021, and so it is the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. And I thought I would just take a few minutes and do what everyone else I'm sure is doing today and share my experience and my thoughts on it, and just kind of remember the situation, because the further and further we get from what happened that day, the easier it's going to be to forget. And there's a whole generation of young people today who are young adults now, 18, 19, 20 years old, some of them even a little bit older, who were babies at the time, who don't remember it because they were too little or they were not born yet. So, like, for instance, my kids, I've got a 13-year-old, an 11-year-old, and an 8-year-old, and we haven't really talked to them about, like, I told them a little bit about it. It's one of those things where, it was a pretty traumatic thing, and you guys might think that I shelter my kids too much, and maybe I do, but they were things that I was like, you guys are kids, just enjoy being kids. There's enough time to learn about the real world as you get older. And so we hadn't really talked about it too much. I hadn't shown them the videos of that day, and they knew the generalities, let's just put it that way. But, especially like my older boys, we had to talk about it the other night, and they started learning about what happened that day and the fallout of what happened afterwards, and it's just kind of crazy to think, like, obviously they're my kids, they weren't alive then, I know that, but as I think about, like, I work with people who are 17, 18, 19 years old who weren't alive at that time, and some of them, it's, you can tell you're getting old when people that you work with are, like, were born after you graduated high school, and it's kind of a weird feeling. Nonetheless, I just wanted to go ahead and share my thoughts with you guys, and I'd love to hear your stories as well, because we all have a story about 9/11, about where we were that day, what was going on, what your reactions were like. So this was my experience. So September 11th, 2001, it was a Tuesday morning, and I was living in Bloomington, Indiana at the time. I was in high school, a freshman in high school that year. A freshman? No, I was a sophomore. Sorry, got my years mixed up. And while I was in class that day, we had a standardized test we had to take. It's called the I-STEP test. I can't remember what it stands for, but it was one of those state-sponsored standardized tests. You're supposed to take it in your sophomore year, then again in your senior year before you graduate. And so we were in the middle of the exam. I think we were in the math or science section. I can't remember which. And we finished that portion of the exam. The bell goes off. We're having a little break. And the principal comes in. And she tells all of us in there that there's a situation that's happened in New York and in Washington, and that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center in New York. So that was a situation where I think my reaction, and all the kids in the class too, I didn't really talk to everybody, but all of them and I had the same reaction. I think most people did, at least the same reaction I heard a lot of people talk about afterwards, that you figure it was like one of these little small private planes, like a little Cessna or something like that. Thinking, man, that pilot hit a building, that's terrible, but okay. We didn't realize what it really was, And she came in again later and said the Pentagon's also been hit. And I wasn't really into politics or news at the time. I wasn't really following much of that, but I knew what the Pentagon was. I knew what it was. I knew it had to do with the military, and it was kind of like the central hub of our military. And I remember thinking, wow, that's two at the same time, two different targets at the same time. And it started to kind of click that it was not an accident. But again, just thinking it was like some little private plane. I wasn't really thinking about it being an airliner. And then we finally got an actual break where we could kind of get out and stretch our legs a bit. So we all went down to the library. Because this is back in the years before smartphones, and internet streaming and stuff. And so there was a big plasma TV in the maybe it wasn't a plasma, it was a flat screen. It was some sort of a flat screen TV. I can't projection screen, I think is what it was. This is back in the CRT days, guys. So everything you think you know about TVs these days, just forget about it. But it was this big, probably like 60-inch projection screen TV, and we went down there, and all of us were kind of huddled around, and I can't remember if it was CNN or Fox News or whatever, maybe it was MSNBC at the time, was on the TV, and there was the pictures of all the smoke billowing out of the towers, and it was pretty scary. It was pretty intense. Like, we were like, wow, that's awful big for a private plane. And they were talking about that it was an airliner that had crashed into the World Trade Center. I could be getting this out of order too. It's been a long time. I think this was the order that it happened in. But I remember standing there watching the smoke coming out, hearing the commentators talking about it, and everybody kind of wondering what was going on. And then we saw the video, and it could have been live. I honestly don't remember if it was live or if it was a recording of it that they just kind of replayed. But we saw the video of the second plane hit the tower, the South Tower, I think it was. And that was a traumatic event. That was very difficult to watch, because I think we all at that point realized, like, this is big. This is something different. And it wouldn't be till later on that we would find out that it was a terrorist attack. We wouldn't find out till later that that a fourth plane had been hijacked and the passengers took it down to protect whatever the would-be target was going to be. And I know I'm missing a lot of details here, guys, because like I said, this is not something I script out. It's just going to be talking about whatever's on my mind that day. And I just remember it being a really hard day. We had to go back, we had to go finish the next portion of the exam, so it was kind of hard to focus after that. I think it was the math test after that, and I was like, I'm not really great at math anyways as it is. It's never my strong suit. And I remember specifically one of the girls that was in the class with me wasn't there when we went back, and later on I found out that her aunt was on one of the planes that hit the towers. So I still think about her on this day. Like, I wasn't really close with her, wasn't really friends with her, but you know, that must have been a really hard time for her. And obviously after the fact, we learned more about what happened. My parents came and picked me up from school that day early. I think all of us kind of left early that day. And I was kind of just glued to the TV. We didn't really talk about it when we got home, at least as far as I can remember. There wasn't really much to talk about because we didn't know what was going on. But I remember just sitting there glued to the TV watching. I can't remember what channel it was. I think it was CNN. And just watching the coverage all day long about it and trying to figure out what this meant, why these people attacked us and these things. And in the subsequent weeks and months, more information came out about what happened. And in a lot of ways, there was a lot of propaganda that kind of came out from that, talking about how they hated us for our freedom, and I think that was an exact quote coming from Fox News and coming from the president's administration, the Bush administration, that they attacked us because they hated us because we were rich and because we had freedom, and you know, I can understand how they got to that conclusion, but really that's kind of a load of crap. I do hold to the idea that Ron Paul had, that they attacked us because we were over there and we were doing things that were upsetting to them. But at the same time, I think I've also come to understand that the viewpoint of the extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda, their hardline approach really does not allow for American liberalism. And I don't even know if liberalism is the proper term anymore, but you got to remember, like, things were different back then. And I know every generation says that as they get older, like, things were different, but like, it wasn't like today where the pushing of LGBTQ stuff and gay marriage and all that stuff was normalized. That wasn't really normal back then. Like, sure, there were people. I had lots of friends who were gay and lesbians and stuff. Didn't really know any trans people back then, but we knew they were around, but it was a very different culture back then. But even so, like, we still glorified violence, we still glorified sex, we still glorified all these things in our pop culture. And when you have a religious view that is diametrically opposed to those things, and that the culture or the country that promulgates that culture and exports that culture around the world proceeds to occupy territory in what you perceive as your holy land, and you follow a religion that teaches that it's vital for you to fight back against that ultimately satanic culture, it's understandable. And I believe that the writings of Osama bin Laden even said that. I haven't read them myself, so I shouldn't actually quote it, but that we're over there, that we're putting our influence into the Middle East, which is their holy land. It doesn't justify it at all, but I feel like trying to use the excuse that it was because they hated us for our freedom. I can understand how they got there, because that is part of American freedom and American liberalism. But it wasn't because we had freedom. Like, they weren't, as far as I understand, they weren't trying to bring about slavery in America. It was that they were fighting back against this infidelity of American culture being promulgated around the world. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but it was just a rough time. And I think that we need to remember this day. We need to remember what happened this day, because it was a very traumatic time for our country. And there's a lot of people who are younger who don't remember it because they weren't alive for it, or they were too young to remember it. And honestly, there's a lot of people who are younger. There's a lot of people who are my age, even who, I'm in my mid-30s here, who have forgotten the significance of that day, and who really, honestly, kind of hate this country. And there's a lot to be criticized about in this country. There's a lot of things wrong in this country, and I admittedly hold a much more conservative, libertarian view on things. And so I see the way that the country's going as a net negative. But at the same time, I've been to other countries around the world. I've been to Mexico, I've been to Belize, I've been to India, I've been to a few different places, and it's like, this is, as messed up as this country is, this really is a special place. It's a unique place. And it's challenging, and it's hard, and it's increasingly frustrating to see the lies that are being promulgated these days, that are being pushed in the mainstream culture these days. That America is this deeply terrible, racist, evil country. And don't get me wrong, we've done a lot of terrible things. And I'm not even talking about the sin of slavery. I'm not even talking about that, because that was hundreds of years ago. Not that we shouldn't talk about it, but that's not what I'm talking about right now. I'm talking about just in the last 100 years, 150 years even, that there's a lot that we've done that is wrong. There's also a lot that we've done that's right, and I think my biggest issue with the culture that we are experiencing today, with this mainstream critical theory-based idea that America is this terrible, deeply racist, evil place, is that it removes any hope for redemption and grace. If you're going to hold not just America, but the culture and the history of this country accountable for things that happened hundreds of years ago, or 50 years ago, or 20 years ago, and you're not going to have any room for grace, then ultimately all you leave is condemnation, and there's no way back from that. Like, America did a lot to change its ways. I know that people don't like the excuse that the Civil War was retribution for slavery. Maybe retribution is not the right word. But in some ways it was. There was a lot of bloodshed to finally end slavery in this country. Which don't forget the actual history of it, that there was terrible atrocities happening, that slavery itself was a human rights violation, human rights abuse. It should never have happened. But to pretend that this country was founded on slavery and racism is a false sense of history. Benjamin Franklin was the president of the Abolitionist Society in Pennsylvania. There were, I can't remember all of them, but there were multiple abolitionists who were part of the founding of this country. And abolitionism is something that went back hundreds of years even before that. I'm pretty sure. Maybe it was just decades, but I thought it was a couple hundred years. And Reconstruction was its own terrible thing that shouldn't have happened. And, I live in the South. I've grown up in the South pretty much my whole life. I grew up in Florida. I lived in Indiana for a little while. I live in South Carolina right now. And, we have to deal with that. We have to deal with the effects of slavery on the culture here. We have to deal with the effects of Reconstruction here. We have to deal with the effects of Jim Crow down here, And what I've noticed, having lived in the Midwest, having lived in the South, having traveled multiple times to the Northeast and to visit family and going all over the country, what you realize is that there is a unique culture in the South because we've had to deal with and we've had to wrestle with and grapple with this. Now, to be sure, you're going to have people who are not great. You're going to have actual legit racists. You're going to have people who still hold to those evil views. I'll just call them evil, But at the same time, we're a very diverse culture down here. There's a lot of black people, there's a lot of Hispanic people, there's a lot of white people, and we all coexist. We all live together. We all work together. We're friends with each other. We don't like all of each other, honestly, all the time, obviously, because you don't like everybody all the time. And I saw a meme the other day that I thought was funny, but it also kind of brought some enlightenment, if you will. And it's stop trying to be liked by everyone because not even you like everybody. And I think that the point I was bringing this up with was that there's a lot to be conscious about with our history, but by focusing so much on the bad and the negative and not having any room for grace or redemption, you are doing a great disservice to yourself and to your community and to your culture and your country at large. Because we did these terrible things. We did. That's just part of our history, and we have to deal with that. We have to own that. We have to own up to the fact that, we had slaves in this country. That we had to fight a war to end that slavery. And even after it ended, the racism persisted. And that there was institutional racism that existed into the 20th century. And that in some places, and not even just in the South, but in some places all over the country, especially in a lot of big cities, to be totally honest. Think about Chicago, think about the blockbusting and the redlining that went on, It's this isn't a thing that's unique to the South. It's not something that's unique to Republicans. It's not something that's unique to these. It's something that we've all had to deal with over the years. But I'm old enough to remember what it was like in the 90s. And the 90s was not a perfect decade, but it was a good decade. It was the first decade in a long time when America was not at war with somebody. The Soviet Union had collapsed. I heard somebody refer to it as that was the decade of the Pax Americana, the American peace, because we prevailed in the Cold War. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. We were no longer at war with other countries. There was a few military interventions here. There was Grenada, I think, was in the 90s. I remember we had a few airstrikes in Iraq. But it wasn't like how it was before, and it wasn't like how it has been after. And I remember in the 90s growing up in South Florida, and my best friends were one kid who was Hispanic. I think his aunt was from Mexico, and he lived with his aunt, and he lived a couple doors down from my grandparents. We played every day. His name was Manuel. He was a great kid. And my best friends in school, one was a white kid, one was a black kid. I'm mixed, and so we just all hung out together. We all played together. We all had fun together, and we didn't focus on our race. We didn't focus on the things that divided us. We all hung out because we liked to play together, because we thought Super Nintendo was awesome, because we were all into wrestling, and WCW was cool and edgy, and, like, oh, wrestling is fun and silly and kid-like, but all of a sudden there's this NWO thing. I'm getting off into the weeds for people who don't like wrestling. That's a whole other thing. But if you were into wrestling in the 90s, you get it. I think that we need to give ourselves grace. And this is coming from the guy who really struggles with giving himself grace. When people come out and they push this critical theory nonsense, and I'm not specifying just critical race theory, because critical theory goes beyond that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, maybe I'll do something to write up on it later or something, I don't know. But critical theory is a neo-Marxist philosophy that encompasses more than just race. It's applied to all different aspects of the culture and all different aspects of what we think about. So, race, gender, economics, social standing, things like that. And when people push this ideology that is focused so much on the negative and does not account for redemption and grace, I feel like we need to push back against that, and not necessarily to be like hateful and angry about it, because, and I admit I've been feeling that way a lot. Like, these people make me really angry, but at the same time, we need to also remember that we're all flawed human beings, that we're all sinful, and that as much as we in our own personal lives have made mistakes over the years, as much as we've made foolish decisions and we've chosen our own sinfulness over what we know to be right and what we know to be good, we need to acknowledge that as a society, as a culture, as a country, that we've done the same thing in our past, and that we're continuing to do so in our future, but that we can address it, we can correct it, and we should move forward from it, and we should extend grace and peace for the things that have happened in the past that we cannot change, but that we are able to avoid in the future. Anyway, I don't know how I got to that topic from 9/11, but anyway, I think that it is an important day to remember. For those of you that were old enough to be alive and to remember it, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your story about where you were on 9/11, what you were thinking, what you were feeling. To those of you who are younger, I'd love to hear your stories too. When did you first learn about 9/11? Like, what is your family's experience with it? I'm sure if you're too young to remember it, your parents definitely remember it. And if you don't really know anything about it, if you haven't really talked to your family about it, I would encourage you to talk with them, to hear their story, to hear their experience, because it's important that we learn from our elders. And if you have grandparents, ask them about their experiences too. I mean, it's pretty crazy. Like, for the younger generation, it'd probably be their great-grandparents, but I enjoy just sitting and talking with my grandmother. She grew up in the Depression. She was born in 1933. And she grew up in the Depression and lived through World War II and the Cold War and Korea. My grandfather was in Korea, and just hearing from them their stories about what life was like back then, it's really beneficial to sit and to glean from the older generations. Anyway, I'm getting way off track, but yeah, I think it's an important day to remember. Don't forget this day. Don't forget what happened. Don't forget what it means. And don't forget the mistakes that were made that got us here. Because since that happened, and this is a topic for another discussion entirely, but our reaction as a society, and as a culture and as a government has really shaped who we are today, and I really don't think that's a good thing. And I pray for our country, I pray for our culture and for our government, and I pray for all of us, because I feel like we really need it, and I don't know where to go from there. But anyway, I'll let you guys go. I'm just kind of rambling at this point. But if you want to follow me, I'm over on... I'm actually getting off of Twitter. I'm not really doing anything over there, and I don't really like having it on my phone. So I took Twitter off the phone. I took mine off the phone too. I'm kind of getting away from social media stuff. But if you want to interact, you can find me over at my website. It's rebornjumpman.com. Also, if you want to read some of my Christian blogs, I haven't really advertised it much. I've kind of been in a dark place lately, and I wanted to. I didn't really want to keep going with that while I was in that dark place. I need to come out of that first. But I have a Christian blog as well. It's ancientabandon.com. And the theme over there is Answering the Post-Christian World, where we kind of address culture and politics and news, but also just kind of do some Bible study and things like that. And I feel like I'm in a much better place now, and I think I'm going to start writing over there some more. So you can find me over there, rebornjumpman.com or ancientabandon.com. I'll have links to those in the description as well. And if you want to actually just interact like on a social level, then I've actually got I'm going to set up a locals group, so we'll see how that goes. Anyway, I hope you guys are doing well. Hope you guys are blessed today. Don't forget what this day means, and spend some time with your family. If you're married, spend some time with your spouse. If you have kids, spend good time with your kids. All right, take care, everyone.